gaily.
We're moving gaily forward. Welcome to the Santa Cruz Queer History webinar series. My name is Rob Darrow. I'm your facilitator today, and we're glad you're here. These webinars are co-sponsored by the Santa Cruz Museum of Art and History and the Santa Cruz Diversity Center. We hope that once the pandemic is over, that you will come to Santa Cruz and see the actual face-to-face queer history exhibit in our Santa Cruz MA. As most of you know, it's now open online, and let's see, do I have a slide of that? I don't, but I'll tell you about that later. Just some regular quick ground rules for everybody. If you've got questions, feel free to add them in the chat room as we go along. And then I wanted to share a little background history with everybody just to make sure that everybody's on the same page. So as I continue my research and talking with people around Santa Cruz, what I've learned is that Santa Cruz County queer history parallels the national LGBTQ history movement. A lot of important people have come through Santa Cruz at different points in time that have impacted the national movement, and people in Santa Cruz have been involved in that as well. As most of you know, UC Santa Cruz and Cabrillo College developed in the 60s, so that enhanced Santa Cruz life, so to speak. And overall, Santa Cruz County has been an inclusive community for many, many years for a lot of different reasons, which is why we're talking about all of this today. On the national level, we know that 1950s, there was this thing called the Lavender Scare, and lots of LGBTQ people went into the closet because they were removed from government and military, and there were laws that were put forth against LGBTQ people. People responded through the 50s and 60s by organizing. The Mattachine Society in Los Angeles and the Daughters of Bilitis in San Francisco. In 1966, we had the Compton's cafeteria riots in San Francisco, and then Stonewall in '69. Santa Cruz organized its first Pride in 1975, and Santa Cruz Pride has continued every year since then. And some of you have been part of these other webinars where we've talked about these other events in Santa Cruz. Today we're focused more on the AIDS project and the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s. So I'm just displaying for many of you who are on this webinar today were around in 1980s when the first news of Kaposi's sarcoma showed up in the New York Times, and then from 1982 on it was called AIDS. And at the same time, Cleve Jones, who's here with us today, conceived of the NAMES project, the AIDS Memorial Quilt, at the annual Candlelight Memorial for Harvey Milk. It's interesting to note that Harvey's birthday is tomorrow, so it's just kind of a coincidence for having this happen today, and we can certainly talk about that as well. That quilt got displayed at the Second March on Washington for LGBTQ rights because of Cleve's work with his friends as well. Parallel to that, in Santa Cruz, the AIDS Project also started in 1985, and we had a series of executive directors. Joe Kinney, who's on here with us today, was one of them. And then in 1989, in March, the AIDS Quilt, the NAMES project, was displayed in the Civic Auditorium. That year, 1989, was an important date in Santa Cruz queer history. And the other people here, Lark and Terry, were part of that as well, and they're going to talk a little bit about that. But here's a couple photos of the Civic Auditorium. Those of us who grew up in Santa Cruz like I did have seen the Civic Auditorium used from many sources. The photo on the left are all of the quilt squares, the panels that were added to the bigger quilt, AIDS quilt at the time, and made by people in Santa Cruz. And some of the people here will talk about that as well. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and move on to the people that you're all here to listen to. So I'm going to start by asking the question, if each one of you could talk about a little bit about who you are and how you're connected with Santa Cruz and how you ended up connecting with the AIDS quilt. And I think if I could, I'd like to start that with Joe, and then go to Lark, and then Terry, and then Cleve. And if anybody else wants to join in after that, that would be great. So Joe, I'll start with you. Joe, are you on mute? Did
Sorry.
Joe go away?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Thanks for clicking on, or whatever the phrase is going to be. I moved to Santa Cruz in 1974 and was hired as the second executive director at the Santa Cruz AIDS Project in 1987. I don't remember whose original idea it was to bring the quilt here, but everyone was very excited about doing it. We had a really good group of volunteers working on it from beginning to end. And it was a incredibly emotional and almost, I would say it was a healing time for people in the community to see our local people who had died connect in with all the other people from all around the country who were part of the quilt.
Great.
So,
Lark, you want to talk a little bit about what brought you to Santa Cruz originally and how you got connected with the AIDS Project and the AIDS Quilt Project?
Yes, so I moved to Santa Cruz in '84 after spending a year and a half. I worked the front desk for one of the resorts there, and spent that year and a half seeing for the first time, my first time, the early cases of men, gay men, bi men checking in at this resort with all kinds of medical issues, um, Kaposi's being one of the most visible. And at that time, it seemed like there wasn't much information about this pandemic, let alone what to do about it. And I kind of realized I needed to get out from under the trees and get a little more involved. And I found that right away in Santa Cruz. I was one of the many, many volunteers who stepped up to help get the Santa Cruz AIDS Project up and going. And I found many, many ways to use my talents. First of all, as a practical support volunteer, then as a street outreach worker. And it also compounded the losses in my personal life to this disease. Suddenly, many of my new friends and longtime friends were dying from this disease. And so it was a bit overwhelming. Even though I was able to be part of a volunteer network, I was still dealing with my own personal issues and my own grief and mourning process. And when I heard about a sewing circle being formed at the Santa Cruz AIDS Project by a group, people with AIDS, I think they called themselves. The living room was actually the support group and the space that we used as our sewing circle. And so that it was a big healing project for me to be involved in that sewing circle and bringing the quilt to Santa Cruz for that first time.
Great.
And
We'll have to hear more about those details in
yes.
just a second. So that's
Okay.
great. So Terry, if you could share a little bit about what got you going in Santa Cruz and how you're connected to all this.
Yeah, thanks. I moved to Santa Cruz in about 1981, I think. I was about 27 years old. I had lived in San Francisco for 3 years and Berkeley for a year and also Marin County. And Santa Cruz seemed like it was the right level of gay community support and close enough to the urban entertainment of San Francisco and all the strengths of San Francisco, and yet not in the intensity and the rush and the crush of everything that was going on there all at the same time. I was just working in the hospitality industry for 5 or 6 years because I was finding myself. I graduated from college. I was a young gay guy. It was kind of nirvana, frankly, back then in Santa Cruz. It was extremely beautiful, not overly crowded, an hour and a half to San Francisco if you really wanted to have a big weekend in the city. And yet your home life at the beach or surfing or hiking was just spectacular and beautiful. And people were very jealous of our lifestyle and how wonderful we had it. It was really fantastic. And then when the AIDS epidemic hit, it was a huge crisis. I spent a couple of years in deep, desperate terror because as a young man, I had a lot of sexual encounters with different people, many of whom turned positive, many of whom died before there was tests available. And when they came out and said, oh, well, you know, don't share bodily fluids, that was actually quite terrifying, because I had done more bodily fluid sharing with a lot of people than I cared to, you know, sort of think about. And I just thought I was a goner. When that didn't happen and I tested negative, it was like being, literally was like being born again. It was like a transition, like, okay, my whole life is like given to me again, because I was quite certain that I would never get through it, given my risk factors or what my perceived risk factors were. And so that is actually what got me the job, where I decided that since I wasn't HIV positive, now I better go and do something about this. And so I was the first or second person hired at the AIDS Project, and my position was the volunteer coordinator. And it was almost an all-volunteer organization in the beginning, and it grew into a larger staffed organization. But in the beginning, everything we did was all volunteers. And my job was to coordinate and regulate and organize and coordinate, communicate with everybody. The quilt we'll talk about a little bit more detail, but that was a very profound expression of the entire community in Santa Cruz getting impacted by the quilt in the way that the quilt does uniquely, which is to put a face on all of the massive kinds of losses that we were all experiencing in the community. You know, there's an expression that, you know, when one person dies, it's a tragedy, and that when 10,000 people die, it's a statistic. What the quilt does is it shows you person by person by person what's really happened. Excuse me. So
Yeah.
it was really, really a deep and profound way of people looking at one person's life after another person's life, after another person's life, after another person's life. And it just went on. So brilliant, brilliant metaphorical way of letting people experience what was happening with the AIDS epidemic.
Mhm.
I'll stop there and let others
Thank you.
share.
So, so Cleve, I understand that you have some connection to Santa Cruz, but I'd love to, you're welcome to share that, but we'd love to hear about, you know, how it all started. And I know you've written about it and that sort of thing, but we'd love to hear how it relates to us in Santa Cruz.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm happy to join you on the eve of Harvey Milk's birthday. Today is also the anniversary of the White Night riots.
Oh, wow. Thanks for bringing that up.
41 years ago, right about, what time is it? About 45 minutes from now, 41 years ago, I was beginning to lead a march down Market Street to City Hall that ended up rather bloody. You know, since you invited me to do this, I've been frustrated because I've been trying to remember the names of people that I knew in Santa Cruz, because I think I would come down to Santa Cruz to play in the early 70s. And I cannot remember the name of there was a gay bar at the time. I think there were two for a while.
Mm-hmm.
I cannot remember their names. Can anyone remind me?
Dragon Moon was one.
Yeah.
Mona's Gorilla Lounge.
Yeah, yeah. And then in 1977, Harvey Milk asked me to start organizing students to get ready for the Briggs, what was then called the Briggs Initiative, which would become Proposition 6 on the 1978 ballot. And we organized these various county by county committees against the Briggs Initiative. And there was a Santa Cruz committee against the Briggs Initiative. And I went down and met with students on campus and other community folks. I met John Laird, I believe, during that time. So I had quite a few connections, and I'm embarrassed that my brain cannot recall all of the names. It seems to me that that display also in some way involved the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence. Am I remembering that correctly? Because I think I drove down there with a group of sisters. And I remember doing a panel talk and being very distracted by this very, very handsome young man that sat on the top row, the back row in the middle. And he was just so darn good looking, I couldn't keep my eyes off of him. And I I met him after it was over, and we became friends. And it's so annoying that I can't remember his name. He ended up starting a gay dance club in Emeryville, I believe. And I would just, I'm frustrated that I don't remember his name. The quilt is connected to the story of Harvey Milk. Because, as I'm sure you all know, every year on November 27th, the anniversary of the murders at City Hall, the candlelight march that happened that night is reenacted to some extent. And for many years, that march, annual march, was quite large. Many thousands of people would participate. And in 1985, as we were getting ready for the march, the death toll in San Francisco hit 1,000. I was very struck by that figure, of course, having known a great many of those first to die. Almost all were in the Castro. Almost all lived and died within 8 blocks of the corner of Castro and Market Street. And I just got obsessed with the fact that there was no evidence, there was no appropriate response from the government, and people needed to find a way to grieve together. And so that night when we marched on November 27th, 1985, we had a poster board and markers, and we asked people to write down the names of their friends who had already been killed. And we marched to City Hall, as we always do, and left our candles there for Harvey and George. And then I had everybody go to the old Federal Building, United Nations Plaza. And I'd hidden extension ladders in the shrubbery. We had a nun with a beard on a bicycle to distract the police, and we put our ladders up and had big rolls of tape on our wrists, and we climbed up and covered the wall with these names. And it was a cold, drizzly night. There were no speeches or music, no chanting, just thousands and thousands of people standing in the light rain and reading these names and whispering to each other that, oh, I knew him, I went to school with him, I didn't know he died. And it was just an overwhelming, it was a deep yearning need to find a way to grieve together and to warn the world of what was coming. And I thought to myself, it looks like some kind of strange quilt. Immediately thought of my grandma back in Indiana, my great grandma, and the quilts they'd made. And it was such a warm, comforting, middle class, middle American traditional values, family values kind of symbol. And I happen to believe in traditional family values and want them to apply to my big, sprawling queer family as well. So that was the idea. And I thought about it for a year, and I talked about it for a year, and everybody told me it was the stupidest thing they'd ever heard of, that it would never work, it was too complicated, it sounded morbid. Even Nancy Pelosi told me that she enjoyed sewing and knew how to sew, but that nobody had the time to sew anymore. She would ultimately get us the permit to display it on the mall for the first time in October of 1987. And there was a considerable contingent from Santa Cruz that traveled to Washington for that march and that quilt display. And I just wish I could remember the name of that beautiful boy that sat in the back row during our talk, because he was just something else. What a sweet boy.
Maybe it'll come to you through all this.
Back, but also really proud. And I think that Santa Cruz's experience with the quilt, it made me feel so good to be there, because I could see that the quilt was doing exactly what we had intended and hoped that it would do.
Great, thank you for sharing that. So why don't we talk a little bit about, for the people who brought the quilt to Santa Cruz, do you recall any of the details of what brought it here and the things that were involved in doing that? Joe or Terry or Lark?
I can start off a little bit and give you a little very background memory. My recollection is that you applied to bring the quilt. There was an application process. It was multi-pages. It asked you a lot of very important detailed questions about how were you going to respectfully bring this huge memorial, sacred, representative of people's lives and deaths to your community, and make sure that it was well tended and well cared for, and how many volunteers did you have, and what was your budget, and it was a thorough application process that involved making sure that it was going to be successfully displayed for the community. So, 6, 8, 12 pages, I don't know. We filled it all out. I think Joe did it and I did it. And if I remember correctly, there was a woman on our executive directors board of directors, who was also a major player, but I don't remember who that was, who had a really strong impetus in doing this. And a number of other people. Tony Shearer was one of the persons with AIDS at the time who was very committed to this. But it was the staffing of the Santa Cruz AIDS Project that did the work, along with volunteers, because we were a volunteer-run organization. So I would say that the staff did a little bit of work on it, like we did a little bit of work on everything, and then the volunteers took it away. And, we filled out our application. I think was probably immediately approved because we probably did all the things correct, I suspect. And then, we signed up for having it come at a certain time and place. And we probably requested, I don't know if it was too early, or there was a time I remember when you could request certain panels that might have been made for people that were lost. But I'm not sure if it was even before that process started. There were panels added to the quilt that people had made. And I think maybe Lark and Joe can talk about that some more. And it was a big project, like putting on a show, so to speak, in that you needed ushers and door monitors and backstage
Yes.
people. And it lasted an entire weekend. And it was very profound. I'll stop there.
Joe, anything else about the organizing part? And then we'd love to hear from Lark about what started those sewing circles. And then I know there's other people on this webinar who are involved in that as well that might want to share.
Sorry, I keep forgetting. What I remember is that there were people who decided to make quilt pieces because the quilt was coming here. It was what gave them the impetus to do it. And what you saw was this large group of people collectively trying to figure out what to put in the quilt. And one of the people I was involved with was Michael Perlman's quilt. And we made it into a Scrabble board. I remember, I think it was Jerry Solomon's idea to do that. But for people who had been involved in different people's lives, it brought them back together. It was almost like a remembrance or an anniversary of the person's birthday or death, where all the people who were part of that person's life in terms of caregivers and practical support people and family members came together again to make the quilt piece. And that's what sticks in my mind. The logistics of applying those kinds of things have fallen away. It's just remembering that it recreated community for those people who we had lost.
Lark, you want to talk a little bit about the quilting circle you were part of and how that went?
Well, I wish I could remember more about it. My memory sort of clouded like my eyes get every now and then when I start remembering those days. What I do remember is that Tony Shearer was the kingpin. He was the mover, the shaker for a lot of things with SCAP those days. And I'm remembering that he was the one who said, oh, we need a sewing circle. The quilt's coming to Santa Cruz. Let's form a sewing circle. And I jumped in because I had been wanting to make a panel for my friend Carrie Grip for over a year and just didn't really know how to do that or get it started. And then, oh, here's a sewing circle I can just join, and there'll be some guidance, and there were canvas 3x6 panels that you create each of our panels. I'm remembering that there were only like a half a dozen of us that were part of that sewing circle, but I also remember there were other sewing circles and other individuals out there creating panels and checking in with our group. Nana Montgomery and her brother Max did a panel for Santa Cruz community for, you know, as a sort of generic for all of those lost in Santa Cruz.
Mhm.
While many of us were in the circle were just focused on individual losses and doing those tributes for individuals. I do wish I could remember more about those days.
So it sounds like the group was together for a couple of months. Would you meet every week and that sort of thing? Do you recall?
I think it was once a week
Uh-huh.
and probably a couple of months.
Yeah. Kind of built the community, and sounds like from what other people are saying, it helped the grieving process, huh?
Mhm.
Oh yes, it was much more than just a sewing circle. There was an art project, a grieving project. It was a way to honor. It was a way to remember.
Yeah.
Also educational. It was very educational for the folks who showed up for the exhibit to go, oh, you know, look, that person looks like me, or gee, he or she was only 23 years old, and that kind of thing. But it was also community building. It was very much a community building effort, the sewing circle and doing the exhibit, because it brought in allies as well, like Nina and her brother Max, who had no connection with the LGBT community. They just wanted to be a part of the project.
You know, I also remember thinking about what you were just saying, Lark. I do remember a lot of straight people coming into SCAP as a result of the quilt. And people sort of starting to get it. Boy, it's a crying kind of day, isn't it? Of like, oh, now I know what you've been through. Now I know what you've been talking about.
Yeah.
So it really did built our volunteer pool. It built our financial support, and brought people closer together. I remember people came forward and said, well, I can't do this, but I can donate this piece, or, you know, I have a restaurant. Maybe we did dinners for volunteers in different pools because we had so many volunteers. And I remember one of the places that we started being able to do dinners came from someone who had gone to the quilt show.
Yeah, I would add to that the educational piece was profound. I mean, you just couldn't see the whole epidemic the same after you were looking at a 23-year-old's life laid out in a handmade 3x6 panel with photographs and mementos of the tenderness of this person's reality. And then you looked over an entire space and you saw 1,200 or 1,500 of them, and you knew you weren't going to look at every one because you didn't have the emotional stamina to see it. And that there's no way that I could give a talk, or any profound speaker can stand in front of an audience and communicate that the same way that the quilt did, in the way that the quilt did. I mean, you can talk all you want, you can read all the books you want, but there was a visceral reality to that experience that was really, really deep. And it changed the community. It was another profound step in emotionally moving and transitioning the Santa Cruz community into the depth of what the people that were gay and a few IV drug users and were going through at that time. It was very, very significant and profound.
Yeah.
I would say that the NAMES Project had a worldwide impact. Has a worldwide impact in terms of the education and the political awareness, the political statement. as well as all of the personal mourning, the grief expressions.
Well, 3 or 4 years later, I was working as the HIV sexual health educator at UC Santa Cruz, and there was a desire by campus participants to bring it up to UCSC. So we did it again up at UC Santa Cruz. And
Yes.
once again, I had these 19-year-olds walking around going, oh, this person was only 22, 23, 18. Like, oh, I guess this could happen to me. It was really impactful.
David and Dan, do you want to talk a little bit about the quilt square your son helped put together?
Sure, I'd be happy to do that, and Dan can join in. I actually have the quilt square on my computer, but I might need some help to know how to show that after I talk a little bit. If we can do a screen share. Anyway, Dan and I have a 42-year-old son, Jared. He was 11 at the time, and helping to talk to young children about AIDS, is a challenge. But several children's authors, famous ones, happened to be gay, and sadly, several of them became, HIV positive and died. Arnold Lobel, who wrote Frog and Toad Are Friends books, was one. Marie Sendak, Where the Wild Things Are, is another one. James Marshall, the George and Martha books. So there's just, gay people are creative. So a lot of the best children's authors have been gay or lesbian. Or anyway, we helped Jared, who was 11 at the time, and a friend of his named Carla Haber put together a quilt square for Arnold Lobel, and because he's one of their favorite authors. And it was very, touching, because just the culture of a sewing circle. I mean, you're quiet a lot, you share some stories, you talk, and it's a textile. So you're touching and chatting. And I remember it being very, very kind of warm. I didn't know Carla very well, so I got to know her, his 11-year-old friend, that way, and just chatting about our favorite stories that Arnold Lobel had written. And I do have it here on my computer, so maybe Rob, you can walk me through how to share it.
So while we do that, let me shift to Cleve for a minute, and
Okay.
Cleve, just ask you. So you kind of heard how the AIDS quilt developed for the people in Santa Cruz. Was that your intention? And you said at one point that it was people said it was a crazy idea, but as you move forward with it, did you help put quilt squares together yourself, and did it develop the way you thought? And if not, how did it go in different ways for you?
When we started the quilt, it was just going to be a one-time thing to be displayed at the march that happened that year. But when we got there, that display was 1,920 panels. And those images, I had correctly predicted, that the media would focus on it. And those images went worldwide. So by the time we got back to San Francisco, we had letters from every state, from countries all over the world, asking us to bring the quilt. So we bought a truck, which we named Stella. And I hired the meanest looking truck driver I could find. Her name was Deborah. And we loaded up the truck, and that first year we went to I think the 10 largest metropolitan areas in the United States, and then went back to Washington. And it was during this time that the chapters were set up. And I don't recall if Santa Cruz ever had an actual Names Project chapter, but I don't think we did.
No.
And those chapters, by the time by about 1995, I think we had 60 chapters in the United States and another 50 around the world. And I think many of you, as I did, always think of quilting as a particularly American folk art, but there's similar traditions and cultures all over the world. So there was a quilt in Singapore, there was a quilt in Brazil. I just recently, within the last year, got to travel to Cuba. And I visited one of the sanitariums where gay people, where HIV positive people had been confined against their will, which is now a community of long-term survivors who live there by choice. And we had a very, very beautiful afternoon with them where we brought quilts from the States for Cuban Americans, and they were displayed there with the quilts that these people had made for their friends who had passed away.
Wow.
I mentioned my grandmother. I was the first grandchild in my family, so I got a lot of love from my grandmothers. And both my grandma and my Nana, I think, would have gladly given their own lives if they could have saved mine. The quilt was started the same year as ACT UP. And ACT UP, was very dramatic and exciting and did some wonderful things. And they wore black leather bomber jackets and Doc Marten boots, and they engaged in very dramatic street theater and civil disobedience. But I wanted to create a place in the movement where my grandmothers would feel comfortable. And the quilt, I think, became an entry point for a whole lot of people who, some of whom had been paralyzed with grief, some of whom just didn't know what they could do, some of them weren't comfortable being overtly political. But I think that the Names Project chapters created that entry point for an awful lot of people of all different ages and backgrounds. And looking back on it, I think that, I think it changed everything for the people we now call LGBTQ. And there's been a bit of, I hear from young people them saying that the focus on marriage equality, for example, was imposed down on the community by heteronormative rich white guys who wanted us all to be normal. And I don't think that's what happened at all. I think that during the pandemic, those of us like myself who thought, well, marriage is just a piece of paper, I don't need the state to validate my relationship, came to understand that the depriving us of marriage equality deprived us of health insurance. And we began to know people who died because they couldn't access their partner's health insurance, or who were thrown out of their homes after their partner died. So, and even more importantly, I think after we went through that experience of caring for people and staying up all night in the ICU and changing the PICC lines and the bedpans and doing the pills, it's like, what do you mean this isn't a marriage? Fuck you. This is exactly what a marriage looks like. So I think AIDS changed the way I think America came to know her gay children during the time of our greatest suffering, and that much of this country was moved. And I think that we as queer people changed the way we looked at ourselves. And it certainly brought men and women together in a way that we saw a glimpse of it in the Briggs Initiative. Lesbians and gay men were working together in that for sure. But to see the outpouring of love and hard work that came from lesbians who were by and large, not personally affected by the epidemic, it meant a lot. It's one of those things I still think of often, is how many women stepped forward to care for their brothers. So it changed an awful lot about our lives, the way we think of ourselves, and the way we are perceived by our other people in this country and around the world.
Thanks for providing that background. So the event happens in Santa Cruz. Could somebody talk about the event itself and what the response was?
I can talk a little bit about bringing actually the physical aspect of bringing the quilt here, because we've been brainstorming and trying to remember what happened, and maybe it was the van or the truck in San Francisco at the last minute wasn't available. And we had to scramble to rent a truck that was big enough and drive up to San Francisco and load it all up and bring it back down again, and then bring it back up at the end of the weekend. And that was like, how the best laid plans mean that in the end, everybody pulled together and brought it down. And I just remember everybody centering, because we were all scrambling and feeling a lot of stress. Was this actually going to work? And in the very beginning, after everything was laid out, if I'm remembering correctly, all of the SCAP family was invited to come in and observe and see the quilt first. And then that was really important.
And we're talking about 250 people.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
mean, that when we
Yeah.
say SCAP family, we don't mean 10 staff people. We mean all the volunteers who were engaged in this Santa Cruz AIDS project that time, which was a lot of people.
Do you
It was
remember?
pretty
Do you remember
profound.
that moment?
I remember being absolutely overwhelmed and couldn't talk. I was immobilized and really moved, because very seldom did we all come together. You know, there weren't very many venues for
Oh,
all these
right.
different volunteers and board members. And yeah, it was pretty amazing. That was the beginning. And it was packed all weekend. And some of us a lot of us were there all weekend, whether we had a role or not. That was home for the weekend.
So like you'd made your quilt stuff in your sewing circle. Do you recall adding it to the quilt or turning it into somebody to be displayed or anything like that? Are you on mute?
You're muted.
I'm unmuted. Yes, I do recall so our sewing circle showed up to help set up for the exhibit also. We added our individual panels to the front of the stage of the Civic Auditorium. I remember like we tacked them up to cover the front of the stage. They were later stitched together, but not for this showing that happened.
Mm-hmm.
But it's all part of the setup. And of course, part of the setup is the unfolding of the sections. So the 3x6 panels are stitched together. I think there are 8 of them stitched together to make one big section, which are folded. It takes 4 people to fold and unfold them. It's all part of the process.
There is a ceremony involved in unfolding the quilt, and it involves people reading names, and it's very intense. It's very powerful. And I don't have a lot of, the more we talk about it, the more I kind of remember my feelings about it rather than any specific events. I will tell you that I lost about 300 people during the epidemic in the first 10 years. All my very first set of friends died, including the people that followed me from the Midwest. I grew up in Michigan. The young friends that I moved to California and said, oh, this is great. You guys should come out here after college. Well, they all died, and all my new friends died. And then I got a second set of friends, and they died. And then a lot of my clients died, and my acquaintances died that I worked at with the project. So I was a very fragile mess, quite frankly. I mean, I was an emotional mess for several years. I mean, on the exterior, I was doing my work, but I only worked at the AIDS project for 4 years, and then I hit a wall here. I'm going on to doing prevention. I cannot really work in the system of loss and ongoing grief process. I needed to go into prevention and go upstream and try to make a difference. So the quilt project was part of the ability to grieve, but I mean, it was a weekend. I mean, I had 10 years of grief to express.
Yeah.
So that's my recollection of it. It was a very emotional process that was just a kind of a touchstone.
Yeah. So Cleve, are these the kind of stories you'd hear over and over as the quilt was sent out to different places? And was there a system in place? And I'm just kind of curious about the reaction that you heard in those early days to your wonderful work.
Oh, well, I still can't sew. I don't get all. I had a big idea. We did a few things. We made many mistakes, but we did a few things right. And one of them was creating the ritual around the quilt. Some of that happened by accident, but the unfolding ceremony, the reading of the names, the absence of speeches and music. We wanted silence. We wanted just the reading of the names. We asked the volunteers to dress in white.
Oh,
And
yeah.
these were sort of unifying experiences that also helped us build the army we needed, because by the time we got to the last display, when we covered the entire mall, that took 15,000 people just to unfold the fabric.
Wow.
So we were always conscious of, trying to build this ever-expanding movement. I learned a lot from doing it. I learned a lot of lessons that have served me well. But for so many people, it was about just revealing what their family, no matter how their family was defined or what it looked like or what color they were or where they came from, but just for them to reveal what they had experienced. And it was incredibly powerful. And as we traveled around, we got even better at making sure that the quilt was actually useful to the people we were visiting.
Mhm.
So it would be displayed as the centerpiece for locally coordinated fundraising and educational efforts. Many people think of it only as a memorial, but it also was a great prevention education vehicle, because we were able to get into some of the most conservative school districts in Utah and West Virginia. We were able to go to middle schools and even elementary schools and begin an awareness of HIV that didn't start with the difficult conversations about sexual behavior and drug use. And it sort of tapered off, but for many years, I would encounter young people in their 20s and early 30s who would come up to me and say, "You don't know me, but you saved my life," because just when I was about to explore with my sexuality, the AIDS quilt came to my high school or my college, and I had never been taught anything about it. I think we tend to forget, and now when we encounter people who may have contracted the disease, we forget that there are still vast swaths of the country where young people are getting no education about sexual behavior, sexual health at all, let alone something HIV specific. And I also want you to know that while we were talking, I remembered his name.
I knew you would.
Who is it?
Does anybody remember Doug Rasick?
I remember the name.
He was from Thunder Bay, Ontario.
Oh my God.
And he lived with a guy up in the hills somewhere. They had a beautiful place. And I remember getting in an argument with them because they were both taking massive amounts of antibiotics to try to keep from getting it. And I said, well, it's a virus. The antibiotic isn't going to help you. But he died in 1996, I believe. Doug Rasick. So ask around if anybody can find a picture of him. I'd like to see it.
We'll put out the word. So the education piece, it sounds like that was a byproduct of the quilt that you didn't think about it. Just kind of, were there other things like that that developed because of the quilt?
Yes, there were a number of things that we didn't. I mean, as I said at the beginning, it was going to be a one-time deal. We were going to show it at the National March for Lesbian and Gay Rights. There was actually resistance from the organizers of that march. They didn't want it there, and the Park Service didn't want it there. But we pushed and pushed, and a number of people helped us get it there. But I was concerned that the march didn't really have any kind of HIV-specific demands attached to it, so I was trying to do that. But a number of things came out. For a while, we had, for many years, we had an interfaith initiative, because it was an ideal, because of the modular nature of it. We could take smaller sections to churches and synagogues. It got really incorporated into World AIDS Day observances all over the world. That continues to this day. The prevention part of it was actually studied. There were two different groups of grad students at two different universities that talked about its role in creating awareness about HIV transmission. I traveled with the quilt in Utah in particular. I remember just being astonished at the warmth and kindness that we encountered. We'd all heard so many horrible stories about young people who'd been abandoned by their families and churches. And I also want you to know that the quilt is back in California. I don't know if you've followed the news, but for the last 19 years, the quilt has been kind of invisible in Atlanta, Georgia, and in my view has not been used effectively. But that pandemic is not over.
Right.
People are still getting HIV. People are still dying of HIV. And thanks to Speaker Pelosi and Congressman John Lewis, the quilt was returned from Atlanta a couple of months ago to San Francisco. The archives from the quilt, and many of you, I'm sure, know, or maybe you yourself contributed panels. People often sent letters with those panels. They would send photographs, diplomas, other mementos, sometimes ashes. And that all of those materials are now in the custody of the Library of Congress and are being digitalized, so that I believe 100 years from now, researchers and scholars who want to get a glimpse of what life was like in America during that period will be able to find that at the Library of Congress. And the quilt itself, the fabric, is now owned by the National AIDS Memorial, the people that created the AIDS Memorial Grove
Yeah.
Park.
Great.
And it is our long-term goal. It's been a bit derailed, of course, by the current situation, is to build a center to house the quilt and be I don't think museum is the correct word, but a structure in Golden Gate Park that houses the quilt and has information about what we went through. So I'm very excited about that.
Yeah, that's great. Several people have asked about current displays of the quilt and that sort of thing. And just so everybody knows, on the front end of, as the exhibit we were putting together, when we are able to physically do it, we do have many of those quilt squares that some of you made, that we have them on order to be displayed at our Santa Cruz Museum of Art and History. So that's an exciting service. It's a byproduct of all that as well. Is there anything else anybody else wants to add to the actual display in Santa Cruz, or the Santa Cruz related piece? And then I'll ask and then I want to show you a couple of the quilt squares that David and Dan brought up, and then give you a chance to talk about what the long-term legacy as you look about in the future is. But I want to see if there's anybody else who wants to add to the conversation that's occurred so far.
I would just note that the exhibit at the Civic included 340 panels at that time. And a little footnote, every time I'd seen the quilt, I've also noticed a new name. Oh, someone I knew or knew of, but I didn't know they had died. There's always that impact, as well as the impact of the reading of the names is always a significant part as well. And someone in the comments asked about the current pandemic, questions about how that relates. I don't know if you want to get into that conversation, but I did a little research recently and noticed worldwide there are 658,000 recorded deaths due to AIDS. COVID is now only about 95,000, just for perspective.
Yeah, great. Any other comments by anybody else at this point before we kind of close this out?
Well, one thing I told you earlier about being this young gay man in San Francisco, and I was there at the rise of Harvey Milk, and I was living there during the White Night riots and all of that. And again, I was 24, 25 years old, and that was a time when there was something like 1,000 young gay men a week getting, or 500 young gay men a week getting off the bus arriving in San Francisco. And San Francisco, you could get a fantastic apartment for $350, which was a lot of money back then, but you got a really nice apartment. And it was an extraordinary time, and I met dozens and dozens of people. It was just an overwhelming sea of celebration. And yet at the same time, 10 or 15 years later, I couldn't find some of those people. And my saddest thing was that, well, I could always go to the Quilt and see if that's what happened to them. I could look them up. Do they have a panel on the Quilt? And it was just a very sad way of thinking, God, is this what I have to do to try to track down an old friend from 9 years ago that I knew, or 15 years ago? But it was, in fact, an institutionalized way of searching for somebody. Like, whatever happened to them? They disappeared, like so many people did at that time, in that whirlwind of social transition and migrations.
Yeah.
So I do remember looking for a friend who had a generic name, Chuck Sims, and I never found him. I didn't find him on the Quilt. He was from a conservative family in Ohio. He just disappeared. You know, I lost touch with him for a few years, and I started looking for him, and I've never found him since. And I just have to make this assumption that he passed away in the epidemic. But I never found a quilt panel, and maybe his family wouldn't have been the kind of family that would have made a quilt, or who knows. But it was just a sign of the times. It was an element of what we were going through.
Yeah. So just to show, David brought up earlier about the quilt square that they made for Arnold LaBelle, and then the Santa Cruz quilts. Oh shoot, are you seeing? Oh.
Saw it for a
We
minute.
did see that. We saw that momentarily. There
How
it
about
is.
now? Okay, there you
Yeah.
go. So you can see the Arnold LaBelle quilt, and then the Santa Cruz pieces. Is the one you worked on in there, Lark, somewhere?
Yes, the bottom left corner.
Okay,
The one
great.
next to it is the one Tony Shearer made
Oh, right
for
down
Richard
there.
Beyer.
Mm-hmm.
And the triangle Santa Cruz was made by Nana Montgomery and her brother Max as part of that sewing circle also.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if Dennis Walsh is in there
We
Or
never got
Denny.
around to making a panel for Dennis.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, we've got lots of pineapple stuff. We should still make it.
Well,
Yeah.
I started thinking about it. I got kind of overwhelmed about, could I make it fabulous enough?
Did any of you know John Mortz?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh my God.
He's still alive?
I don't know, but talk about forgotten names.
He lived up in Felton, I think.
Yeah.
Oh, you mean Ray Mortz?
No, John Mortz.
John Mortz.
John
He's
Mortz.
a younger guy. I think he might have been related. Oh yeah, he was. Yeah, I thought everybody would have met him, but anyway, I'll have to
Great.
think what circle of friends he was in.
Yeah. So I'd love to give the Joe, and then Lark, and then Terry, and then Cleve, you get the last word here. Just kind of, as you think back to, in particular, the AIDS quilt display in Santa Cruz, what the long-term legacy and what it means to people today, any aspect of that you'd like to share, we'll close it out with that. And then if people want to stick around afterwards and chat some more, we can certainly do that. So Joe, why don't we start with you, and then Lark, you'll be next.
You know, a few years after I left SCAP, I was in DC and went to the Vietnam Memorial. And if you were looking for someone, you could go over to this book and open it up, and it was, you know, cataloged in different ways. And I got a total rush that the quilt was our memorial, because by that time you could find out who had a panel. It was the same generation of people, because we were all young, you know. We died in that war, and we died in this war. The other thing I wanted to say was, we were talking earlier, Lark and I, and about the people who survived, who are still here, who are still in Santa Cruz, who were volunteers and were clients, and we got to grow old with them. And that's a happy thing.
Yeah.
So
Thanks, Joe. Lark?
Yeah, I remember all of those birthday parties when we would go, gee, I hope I make it to 40.
Mm.
I also remember those early days of HIV when we weren't sure if we could kiss even. And so the similarities to the current pandemic are stark in those regards. But what also stands out is there's still no vaccine for HIV.
Mhm.
And there's quite a focus on it right now. I don't remember there ever being much of a focus on HIV. And those first many years of HIV, there was no response from our government. And it sort of parallels what's going on today. I just reread this editorial from UCSC's City on the Hill newspaper, which sort of, I put it in the comments here, but I'll read just a little bit of it. It's the AIDS Memorial Quilt, born of one person's grief and loss, has grown exponentially into a grim reminder of the failures of the nation's public health policy. And here we are, how many decades later, with a similar scenario going on with another pandemic. At the same time, I hold a lot of hope. I learned a lot through the AIDS era, mostly about just not internalizing and finding what I can do and doing something, even if it's only a little something.
Well, I want to thank you, Lark, for creating the photos and saving those photos over the years so that you could give them back to us to be able to share. So hopefully you've seen some of them in the exhibit and the other things as well. So we thank you for that because it'll always be there for people to see. Terry, final thoughts from you about the overall impact of that time period and the AIDS quilt display?
Well, I think the AIDS quilt coming to the Civic Auditorium at Santa Cruz was an example of Santa Cruz's high level of capacity to respond fully as a community, 100%, as much as any community could, given the size of it and its resources, to this tragic epidemic that was happening. I mean, remember, Santa Cruz also had one of the first gay mayors in the United States. When John Laird was elected, he was one of 4 mayors elected to a small town in our communities that year. And Santa Cruz has always been a strong, powerful beacon of progressive, smart, advanced thinking and development in society. And it's important that somebody does that. It's not important that we're a smaller community and so therefore we don't have as much impact as Houston or Washington or Chicago. It's important that we did it and it's on record and you're memorializing it. And if one community can do it, 2 can do it. And if a small community can do it, a larger community can do it. And I think that's part of what is really important about us doing it. The more that I think about it, if I remember correctly, we wanted to bring the quilt back into Santa Cruz the first that we heard about it. And in our application process, I think they said, well, it has to finish this 10-city tour and then we'll bring it to Santa Cruz. Right now we're doing this 10-city tour. And I had forgotten that until Cleve mentioned that. And I believe that we were one of the very first cities of our size to do this. And it made a profound impact and it did what it was supposed to do. And it made a big difference to us and our community. It was a valiant response by the people of Santa Cruz. That's, I think, the legacy.
For sure. Cleve, your final comments on the overall impact, and then somebody asked the question, will it ever get displayed again? So maybe you know the answer to that question. Oops, you're on mute. Let's see.
Yes, it will be displayed again. We had scheduled a display in Golden Gate Park, which had to be postponed due to the current crisis. But yes, we're going to make it useful again, and we're going to make it accessible again. And I want to thank all of you who were part of bringing it to Santa Cruz. I remember that time quite well. And I think it was a valiant effort. And there are so many parallels between the situation then and now. Obviously, the diseases are very different, but unfortunately, both of them emerged at a time when we had a president who failed to perceive the gravity of the situation, who mocked those who were most affected, who failed to act, who squandered the advance warning they'd been given, and chose to divide rather than unite. And this quilt, as I mentioned at the beginning, is connected to the story of Harvey Milk, a man of great empathy who crossed all sorts of boundaries and barriers. And I think that was the greatest lesson I learned from him, which was to try always to find common ground as we face these struggles together. And I think that is a big part of the message of the quilt and why it succeeded. And the other biggest part of it is people like you who took up this effort and made it your own and poured your heart and souls into it. And for that, I am very grateful forever. Thank you.
Great. Well, I want to thank all of you for being here and being part of this. And we'll save this and share it with other people as part of our exhibit in Santa Cruz.